Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the British Library. I'm Xerxes Mazda, Director of Collections and Curation here at the Library, and also on the Selection Council for the Panizzi Foundation. And a really, really warm welcome to this, the 38th annual lecture series of the Panizzi Lectures. Welcome to those of you who've braved the train strikes and the rain and the bad weather to be here on site, and a warm welcome to all of those of you who are online, joining us online as well. And we're hugely grateful to Jonathan Hill and Sokol Books, distinguished booksellers in New York and London respectively, for sponsoring the costs of live streaming this event. And wherever in the world you are tonight, thank you for tuning in for this lecture. So the Panizzi Lectures were founded about 40 years ago by Catherine Devis, a long-time lover of both books and the British Library, and they were named after a key member of staff who helped shape the library in the 19th century. Sir Anthony Panizzi served the British Museum for nearly 40 years as a principal librarian from 1856 to 1866. Panizzi was a moving force in creating the great cultural institution which we now know today as the British Library. He created the library's catalogue, built its famous round reading room, and turned it into the biggest library in the world. The lectures, these Panizzi lectures, build on his achievements by using the library's resources to advance knowledge and understanding in any field associated with the history of the book. They are a central and integral part of the library's events programme, and we're always keen to develop as wide an audience as possible for these lectures, to encourage people to be excited and inspired by discovering more, perhaps in unexpected ways, about the history of the book. Since 1985, that brief has been addressed by a range of distinguished scholars, and it is the challenge and privilege of the Selection Council to sustain that roster. So this year, I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Professor Henry Woodhausen, the Rector of Lincoln College, Oxford. Henry was appointed a lecturer of University College London in 1982 and remained there for 30 years, becoming a professor, head of the English department, and finally Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. In 2012, he moved to Oxford as Rector of Lincoln College. His administrative and other duties in that capacity have not diminished his research enthusiasm or output, and he's built on his core interests around 16th and 17th century English literature. His books include Sir Philip Sidney and the Circulation of Manuscripts and editions of Renaissance poetry. He co-edited the 2010 Oxford Companion to the book, and he has just published a groundbreaking piece on the 17th century second-hand book trade in the latest Oxford Companion. His topic for the Panizzi Lectures is the fascinating figures of Thomas Hearne, diarist, antiquary, librarian, and non-juror. A familiar name if you've worked on Oxford book culture around the turn of the 18th century, but someone who has not been seriously studied for some time. Judging by the first lecture, Henry is now certainly putting that to rights. And tonight, we're in for an entertaining and thoughtful second lecture in this series of 3. So Henry, please, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. Pleasure to be back. Once the Bodleian paradise was lost, Hearne denied himself access to its treasures, but he was still able to consult books in college and some private libraries. He could also buy them. The preservation of books and manuscripts was for him a form of scholarship. He particularly admired Matthew Wren, Master of Peterhouse and Bishop of Ely, a true antiquary who has left collections wherever he went. The Cambridge men, he said, are much wanting to themselves in not retrieving the remains of their worthies. Thomas Baker, his great Cambridge friend, is the only man I know there that hath of late acted in all respects worthily on that head, and for it he deserves a statue. It's a pleasing idea, but unlikely that there would be much public support, I fear, for statues of book collectors. In Hearn's eyes, Baker's collecting was heroic. He admired people with a study of books, a large, curious, noble, fine, or ample study of books, a good, very good study, or even an excellent study of books. He was thinking not so much of the physical space where books were kept, a room, cupboard, bookcase, or box, as an individual's entire private library. In the trade, Hearn particularly admired Christopher Bateman, a most noted bookseller who understood books incomparably well and used to buy whole studies. Baker was, like Hearn, a non-juror and an important book collector, whose printed books have been very well described by Franz Corsten. Non-jurors collected books because the history of the church in England was a central element in their justification for not taking the oaths of allegiance. Besides Baker, Hearn's non-juring friends included a number of noted collectors. His tutors, Henry Dodwell and Francis Cherry, Oxford colleagues like George Hicks, and social contacts such as Charles Aston and Richard Middleton Massey, a man of good curiosity. Above all, there were the Rawlinson brothers, Thomas and Richard. Non-jurors collected books for other reasons. The authorities in church excluded them from libraries at Oxford and Cambridge, the Cotton, Lambeth and Sion College libraries in London, and probably all the cathedral and abbey libraries. Largely unable to take paid employment, some non-jurors also saw the second-hand trade as a possible source of income. Hearn was one of these, following the previous century's bookmen who acted as agents in buying, selling, and cataloguing books. In the next lecture, I shall look at Hearn's own attempts to produce handsome books that would appeal to collectors, but there's good evidence for developing tastes in the period among them. The new college schoolmaster, James Badger, was said to have a most curious collection of the classic authors and the finest editions. Hearn's friend John Bridges boasted that for his collection, I've always endeavoured to procure the best and rarest copies and of the finest paper. Having heard that the physician Richard Mead was making a collection of books printed at our theatre in large paper, Hearn sent him a copy, in the same paper, large paper, of Henry Dodwell's De Parma Equestri Woodwardiana Dissertatio, 1713. Hearn noted that the Gloucestershire antiquary Richard Graves would never keep any printed book but what was extremely clean and fair. New paths in book collecting also attracted his attention. Mr. William Beckett, he recorded, hath an excellent collection of books relating to tobacco. This sense among some collectors that books were constituted of more than their contents alone went with an enthusiasm for certain types of printed books. Inevitably, Hearn sought books nobly printed upon vellum, such as an imperfect copy of a folio, Sarum Missal, printed at Rouen in 1510, that he came across in the Bodleian, or Thomas Linacre's edition of Galen's De Temperamentis, printed by Sibbert at Cambridge in 1521, upon vellum, the very copy that the author presented to Henry VIII. Books printed on vellum were special, Hearn thought, because they might connect the author to his patron. No doubt he was pleased by Harley's loans of early English books on vellum and Charles Eyton's generous gift to him of a Hereford Missal of 1502 on it. He also paid attention to contemporary books printed on parchment, such as John Norden's description of Cornwall, Speculi Britanniae Pars, printed with 4 copies on vellum in 1728. It's a big book. It's a very big and heavy book, even as a quarto. And in the next year, the non-juring related reprint of John Bale's account of Sir John Oldcastle. This was limited to 250 copies. Hearn listed the owners of 6 printed upon a fine writing vellum. The non-jurors used the material for their most important documents, such as their Book of New Consecrations. If vellum books took collectors close to a personal collection with their making, annotated books, as well as preserving comments and readings, took them even closer. Hearn clearly shuddered when, as early as 1707, he recorded that a copy of Dionysius of Halicarnassus that had belonged to the schoolmaster and physician William Hill once had in it several of his notes, but the negligent, ignorant bookseller partly cut them out. The rest he got out with aqua fortis. Annotated books were valuable as sources for publishing projects. Among his own treasures was a copy of the 1615 edition of William Camden's Annales with the author's autograph revisions, annotated by Camden for a new edition. This was the source for Hearn's own 3-volume 1717 edition of the Annales that got him into much trouble with the university authorities. He also had a similarly revised copy of the 1607 edition of Camden's Britannia and contemplated publishing this as well. John Hudson, Bodley's librarian and Hearn's one-time friend, gave him a copy of John Keyes's De Antiquitate Cantabrigiensis Academiae Libri Duo of 1568, with his Oxford opponent Thomas Keyes' manuscript notes. This lay behind Hearn's 2-volume 1730 edition, recording the dispute between the two men about which was the older university. Well, we know the answer to that. Hearn was also interested in autographs and modern hands. He was not alone in either pursuit. Ralph Thoresby pestered him and others for original letters and any autographs. Nothing can come amiss that is remarkable, either for the person or the subject, Thoresby wrote. In the 1720s, as treasurer of Christ Church, Thomas Tanner cut signatures out of the college's books. The historian of printing, John Bagford, collected title pages, many of which were inscribed by previous owners. Humphrey Wanley put together his elusive Book of Hands. Thomas Rawlinson also cut signatures out of printed books and stuck them in albums. Hearn himself recorded that in 1718 he had got the signature, dated 1503, of Richard Nix, Bishop of Norwich, cut out of a quarto edition of Aquinas' Summer that I accidentally saw in a bookseller's shop. Hearn would have been sympathetic to Nix's opposition to Lollardy and the spread of the Reformation. There were other reasons for thinking about handwriting. Like many of his contemporaries, Hearn suffered from a constant itch to attribute anonymous works. Ideologically, he could admit no doubt about who wrote Icon Basilicae, and he was deeply interested in the vexed question of the author of the Imitation of Christ. The mysterious authorship of the Whole Duty of Man revolved around disguised hands among the copyists of the manuscripts of his works. Hearn's extensive investigations into this matter touched on paleographical grounds when he wrote of 2 of the manuscripts. Some of the letters in the manuscripts are exactly of the same make, the same distance of lines, etc. If the authorship of the works has ever been agreed, it's generally accepted that they are by Richard Alistry, a royalist and Christchurch divine. More unusually, Hearn's interest in the archaeology of books extended to the history of bookbindings. John Bagford was certainly interested in medieval and Tudor bindings, but it was Hearn who published what may be the first engraving in England of a medieval binding. In the last volume of his edition of Leland's Itinerary, he included an image of the upper cover of the Sherborne cartulary, consisting of a small 13th century enamel plaque of an angel. This was added to the manuscript 100 or so years after its production in the second quarter of the 12th century, and replaced the missing central carved panel. Hearn thought the binding was the original one and that the angel was the Virgin Mary. He noted that the wooden boards were an inch thick and that there must once have been some sort of lock to it. I'm sorry I can't give you a modern picture of the Sherborne cartlery. It's unavailable on the British Library website for reasons we all know at the moment. It would make this rather sad illustration look a little happier. Another such treasure was the Book of Llandaff, dating from the 1120s and 1130s. Tanner showed it to Hearn in 1732. It hath a very thick wooden cover, in one side of which is a brass figure of our Saviour, or perhaps, he thought, of St. Taylo, Llandaff's second bishop. The upper cover had been replaced in 1696, but the lower one still exists and is generally accepted to show Christ in his glory. With both these medieval manuscripts, Hearn sought to associate the decorated covers with the mysterious astles that King Alfred mentions in the preface to the Pastoral Care. Hearn's interest in bindings extended to later periods in which he thought about them contextually. In 1731, he noted that Richard Rawlinson had given him an engraving of an old ivory chalice he owned, with the inscription Ave Maria Gracia. Hearn's reason for doubting its age was that he had seen much such figures and such inscriptions on the covers of old and written books about the time of Henry VII and Henry VIII. I have seen on covers of books, he said, figures including St. Peter and the Virgin Mary and dogs. He was evidently thinking of Tudor blind-stamped and panel bindings. Hearn judged the chalice was foreign work and was right about its age. It's thought to have been produced in Africa, probably for the Portuguese market in the 16th century. For theological and political reasons, Hearn was particularly interested in the publishing history of the 39 articles of religion stating the doctrines and practices of the Church of England. He assisted his friend Thomas Bennett of Colchester in his researches into the subject. These resulted in an essay on the 39 Articles of Religion, 1715. It's a remarkable piece of work and well worth having a look at. Bennett collated the 18 earliest editions of the Articles, paying particular attention to Article 20, setting out the authority of the Church. He thanked Hearn for his work collating the two Bodleian copies of Rainer Wolf's 1563 edition, which he called Bod 1 and Bod 2. Bod 1 has a parchment roll attached to it, has a parchment roll fastened to it containing the names of about 100 persons who composed the lower house of convocation in 1571. Bennett asked Hearn whether the parchment roll was annexed when the book was first bound or stitched, or whether 'twas added since. Hearn reported his findings, based on a close examination of the volume, in a letter of Christmas Eve 1712. I infer that the book was originally bound or stitched before the roll was added, but that 'twas unbound or unstitched afterwards on purpose to receive the roll. In other words, the book hath been bound or stitched twice. He continued by saying that his argument was not just my own opinion, but likewise it is the opinion of a very understanding bookbinder whom I have made use of upon this occasion. Although his detective work is impressive, Hearn's willingness to get a professional opinion from one of our Oxford binders, perhaps William Seal, of whom more next week, is striking. In April 1722, John Murray famously told Hearn that my collection of books was the oddest that he ever saw, and that if I were to sell them by auction, they would bring as much money for the number of them, he believed, as ever any collection in England. By oddest, he meant most unusual or extraordinary, and this was despite, perhaps even because of, Hearn's relative poverty. Nor have I a purse to buy such books of antiquity and philology that I want, he once wrote to Richard Rawlinson. Hearn's love of old books was not simply born out of curiosity. his library was essential to his preparation of the volumes he published, especially to the elaborate glossaries and notes that he added to editions of medieval works. Hearn kept his study of books in his rooms. They were double-sized set on the north side of the front quad over the buttery in St Edmund Hall. They overlooked the churchyard of St Peter in the east, with windows on both sides, to the north and the south. He referred to his rooms as my study, my own little cell, museilio meo, where he kept his little library, the small number of books I have. He furnished his room with prints of various people, a very large print of James III, and a mezzotint of the late Countess Dowager of Lichfield. John Bagford's portrait hung by the small Colemans, that is, Thomas Britton. A third portrait Hearn had was of Anthony Wood. His admiration for Wood, Wood's devotion to the university and his historical researches and his Athenae Oxonienses, was tempered by a recognition of his deficiencies. Although the two men never met, as far as I can tell, Hearn clearly saw himself as Wood's successor in some ways. In his rooms, Hearn arranged his books according to 6 classes. The East Press held chronicles, antiquarian books, and manuscripts. Favourite books were in what may have been the Northwest Press. Politics belonged to a press with the Greek uppercase letter theta. Lowercase lambda was for sermons. Fen, F-E-N, probably beneath a window, held ephemeral pieces, and Pix N, perhaps a box on the north side of the room, had further antiquarian works. In addition to these, there were about 14 different designations for separate areas of shelving. Hearn dated his earliest known catalogue of printed books, 14th of May, 1709. In it, he wrote the acquisitions he made in numerical order up to 3018, adding a price to each entry. On the page in front of you, he changed his mind about what those prices meant, inserting a not into the statement that they were what he paid for his books, but at what prices they were sold, generally sold. A few years later, in one of his diary volumes, he made a fairly rough index of authors' names. The acquisitions register was used as the basis for a later shelf list. He rather vigorously, a later shelf list. As he copied entries from the acquisitions list to the shelf list, he rather vigorously deleted the entries. He began his catalogue of manuscripts at about the same time as the acquisitions list of printed books. Now, a volume's shelf number might be written on its fore-edge. The acquisition number might appear on an end paper or title page. Hearn's library could be reconstructed from these 3 sources and from a 4th one. After his death on the 10th of June 1735, Thomas Osborne published a catalogue of a fixed price sale beginning on the 16th of February of Hearn's books. The catalogue is remarkable not just for the number and quality of lots it contained, but because it bears a curiously engraved portrait of Hearn on its title page. I don't think that such an illustration of a book collector had been included in a sale catalogue before, but I hadn't looked at every single sale catalogue before 1736. Unfortunately, Hearn's books were mixed with the smarter and more expensive collection of another gentleman of note who has evaded identification. The dispersal of his library was further complicated because Hearn left his manuscripts and printed books with manuscript notes to William, the eldest son of his great friend Hilkiah Bedford, a non-juring bishop. When William Bedford died in 1747, the collection was catalogued by the London bookseller John Whiston, a lad, it seems, of great quick natural parts and understanding, as Hearn wrote. Whiston's list was the basis of the sale of this collection to Richard Rawlinson for £105. And Rawlinson's books came to the Bodleian by his will in 1755. In this way, some of the best parts of Hearn's books and manuscripts went to the institution that had excluded him and treated him so badly. We don't want Mr. Hearn's books, the Regius Professor of Greek, Thomas Terry, a curator of the library, had said when Hearn offered to give the Bodleian books it lacked, including some of his own publications. It would be possible to use these various sources to create a conventional catalogue or virtual library of Hearn's collections. Plenty of his books survive in the Bodleian, British Library, and around the world. Almost all have his motto, suum cuique, the ambiguous Roman tag that can be translated as to each his own, or as Shakespeare put it, that every man should take his own. Although he often dated his acquisitions and gave some indication of their source in the books themselves, he rarely mentions his day-to-day purchases of individual titles in his collections. The task of reconstructing Hearn's collections would be demanding, but not impossible. It's not for today, however. Hearn thought about books not just in relation to their format, but to the number of sheets they contained. That's how he measured their contents. Shorter books were generally called pamphlets, which, like booksellers' catalogues and manuscript papers, came in bundles, as he called them. As time went on, he referred more and more often to shorter books as things, little things, small curious things. The language he used in the 1709, in the 1709 acquisitions and the later shelf-less catalogues reflects this. He calls his books a rare thing, a wonderful rare thing, a strange, scarce old thing, and a curious, scarce thing. The key terms relate to rarity, scarcity, and curiosity. Items may be very rare, wonderful rare, of very great rarity, very rare and very dear, now grown scarce, very scarce, wonderful scarce, so scarce they are worth any money. And a curious book, a curiosity, a very great rarity and curiosity. Sometimes he uses the Latin of booksellers' catalogues, such as Libellus Praeraris or Liber Pulcherimus ac Rarissimus. One of the highest values he placed on his own books was £17 for a 1655 set of Dugdale's Monasticon. How dear his books were to Hearn was usually judged by his general unwillingness to lend them. In particular, in March 1729, he explained to the herald John Anstice that he could not borrow a manuscript of the new college statutes. If I should lend to one, I must lend to another. For being debarred the Bodleian Library, I am now confined to my own books, which I am every minute using, and therefore desire to be excused from parting with any, even for so little a time as a minute. Hearn's greatest interest was, I think, in early English printed books. Of course, that interest included the beginnings of printing in Europe more generally, and the particular dispute about whether it started at Mainz or Haarlem. Like many people interested in early books, Hearn became rather obsessed with Schädel's Nuremberg Chronicle, one of the strangest printed books that ever I saw. Its woodcuts made it wonderful curious. He had seen it as a schoolboy and came to own a serviceable copy. He had quite a few incunabula. There are nearly 40 of them in the Bodleian. And his classical texts and chronicles were used in his own researches and publications. When the books of an earlier collector, Thomas Baskerville, came on the market, Hearn looked at the poor state of his early English chronicles and remarked, "Nor indeed is the whole altogether of any considerable value, there being no classical books, nor hardly any Greek or Latin books among them." It's hardly surprising that in Oxford a premium was placed on classical books and books in the learned languages. But Hearn was also, I think, pointing out the relative cheapness of old English books. These were still undervalued, but satisfied his criteria of rarity, scarcity, and curiosity. 15th and 16th century English books were becoming collectible. He was especially interested in the products of the early named presses, Caxton, De Worde, and Pynson. In this respect, Caxton, De Worde, and Pynson. In this respect, Pope might have been thinking of Hearn when, in the Dunciad, he described Tybalt's library as containing the classics of an age that heard of none. There Caxton slept with Winkin at his side, one clasped in wood and one in strong cowhide. He was excited by the products of these early English presses. He sought out early editions of Chaucer to help his friend John Urry of Christchurch in his editorial labours. Anything to do with the English Reformation and its precursors, especially old Bibles, prayer books, and the 39 articles, as we've seen, sermons and literary works connected to this history, such as Piers Plowman, maps by Ralph Agus and Christopher Saxton, and above all, chronicles, and especially the 2 editions of Holinshead, the second with their mysterious excised leaves or castrations. Books relating to the 2 universities interested him, as did the whole of the nation's political and religious history down to the present time. In surveying this wide field, Hearn had few maps to guide him. He did not own a copy of Andrew Mansell's Catalogue of English Printed Books of 1595, but his friends did. Hearn had a good collection of auction catalogues, which were always important sources for bibliographical information. In particular, he used the 1682 auction catalogue of the books of Richard Smith a great deal. He knew that Smith's famous, very noble and very extraordinary collection of more than 8,000 books, sold over 24 days, included many owned by Humphrey Dyson. But it was Smith he really admired. He was a very learned, curious, and accurate man, and I have a very great honour for his memory. Smith's English books of the 16th and 17th century really interested Hearn. These were curiosities and rarities. John Bagford was also an enthusiast for Smith's books and had part of a manuscript catalogue of them that Baker was keen Hearn should have to help complete your collection of Mr. Bagford's papers. Bagford was one of Hearn's best friends. They gave him books and manuscripts. The 2 men corresponded and met quite frequently in Oxford. They shared an interest in writing the history of early English books, but finding a form in which this could be realised was not easy. Bagford published proposals in about 1707 for an essay on that most useful art of typography. The project evolved in various ways, some parts of it reaching print in the form of corrected proofs, but unfortunately, Bagford never got the subscribers he needed. He also lacked the ability to organise his vast amounts of material into a coherent form. This melancholy story of failure can be followed in Hearn's collections between 1707 and Bagford's death in 1716. As late as May 1719, Hearn was planning a history of the original and progress of printing. Nothing came of Hearn's own attempts to write that history. He felt that Bagford's papers really belonged to him, but in December 1716, 7 months after Bagford's death, he learnt that Harley, Edward Harley, the Earl of Oxford, had acquired them. He suspected that Harley's librarian, the paleographer Humphrey Wanley, whom Bagford thought a knave and an opiniator, bought them for his employer to block his access to them, so that he could write the history of printing. But Wanley, too, never used them. The question of how to write the early history of printing was not satisfactorily resolved, I think, until Joseph Ames produced his Typographical Antiquities in 1749. Ames drew on Bagford's collections, and like Bagford and Wanley, collected manuscript and printed fragments, especially title pages. Hearn had access to at least some of the fragments Bagford collected, and told him, "I shall be glad to see all fragments you meet with." Although Hearn appreciated the value of such pieces and was suitably shocked when he heard about an Oxford surgeon who turned old fragments to tobacco pipe use, he was not above telling Thomas Rawlinson, "I have laid a few of these fragments by and have burnt the rest as things of no moment." Rawlinson, Thomas that is, had his own collection of fragments, and his brother Richard told Hearn, "I daily heap up fragments to enclose in parcels as I find opportunity to send them." Hearn's interest in them must have been widely known in bookish circles, for in April 1731, Robert New of the Middle Temple, a gentleman personally unknown to me, sent him a collection of many manuscripts and printed old fragments in vellum and paper, which Mr. New presents me, having procured them out of the sale of Mr. Peter Leneve's books. Mr. Leneve, it seems, was curious this way. Hearn included some of these fragments in his collections, as he saw last week. But he also bound them into copies of his own books. He recognized the importance of material reused in book bindings, And as we have seen, he was doing this while he ranged the shelves of the Bodleian. But he also noticed fragments of an ancient manuscript, 700 or 800 years old, of St. Jerome's epistles, put there as strengtheners in University College's register. At least 6 volumes of manuscript fragments can be associated with Hearn. There are probably more. They were not just historic curiosities, but useful to him in his researches, and he spent a good deal of time trying to identify what they were. As a book collector, Hearn relied on loans and gifts as well as purchases. Most of his friends were bookish. They gave him books and manuscripts to further his research because they would be of interest to him, or as marks of friendship. The friend most generous with his loans and presents was Thomas Rawlinson. His death in August 1725 was a blow to Hearn, who praised him as a great lover of books, adding that the booksellers ought to erect a statue to him. Another statue to a book collector. Despite the claim that he understood the editions and title pages of books only, hence his being called Tom Folio or Tom Folio in the Tatler, his Oxford friend maintained that he was a great reader and had read abundance of the best writers, ancient and modern, throughout. Some evidence for this can be found in Rawlinson's series of notebooks containing bibliographical notes and extracts from his manuscripts, printed books and engravings. He sent at least 26 of these to Hearn in Oxford. Although none of them is known to survive, Hearn copied extensive extracts of their contents. "Your notes will be very acceptable," he wrote to Rawlinson in January 1716. The collector started sending him the notebooks early in February, only a few weeks after Hearn's exclusion from the Bodleian. Rawlinson knew all about that episode, and the notebooks may have been linked at first to Hearn's search for material in Rawlinson's collection to publish, but they became a lifeline for Hearn's interest in the old books and antiquities no longer available to him in the library. The last reference to Rawlinson's notebooks occurs in September 1717, more than 20 months after Hearn first noticed them. Most of the Rawlinson brothers' correspondence with Hearn, unfortunately, has not survived. So what happened next is not entirely clear. But in February 1719, Thomas started sending his Oxford friend boxes of what Hearn called things to read, old things, or cargoes. In March, he could report to Rawlinson, "I have not yet read over the first cargo, though I spend some time every day upon it, and that with very great pleasure, extracting many things from your books, which makes amends for the exclusion from the library." The boxes continued to arrive. Between February 1719 and April 1724, at least 17 came to Hearn, often with a cash gift in them of as much as 25 guineas from Rawlinson, sometimes with books that were gifts to him. Hearn felt free to annotate the contents. You will find memorandums at the beginning of each book signifying that I borrowed them of you and that I have read them over. Posterity will judge thereby, when you and I are retired to our graves, that I am indebted upon this account to you. Not quite sure how keen collectors would be to have people write their notes in their books. Sometimes the lid of the box he was being sent broke. Sometimes the whole box broke and the books were damaged. When that happened, Hearn reported to Rawlinson, "I have employed the broken box for little shelves, and I thank you for giving me so good a hint to dispose of it in that manner." The boxes were sent sporadically and tailed off as Rawlinson's health declined and as his financial troubles grew in terrible proportions. Nevertheless, the contents of the boxes, especially the gifts in them, were a further testimony of Rawlinson's generous kindness. Of course, Rawlinson, whose library is estimated to have contained between 50,000 and 200,000 books or volumes, and 1,000 manuscripts, could just about afford to let some of his collection out of his sight for a while, but the boxes certainly helped to make up for the recipient's loss of the Bodleian. A similar story could be told about Hearn's relations with the Harleys, but these were complicated by his unhappy relationship with Wanley. For Hearn, the Harleian library was a particularly rich source for manuscripts that assisted him with publications. From Edward Harley himself, there were also generous cash gifts. Gifts and loans made up a significant part of Hearn's acquaintance with books and manuscripts. Two instances must stand for many. On Tuesday, the 19th of October, 1725, the Gloucestershire antiquary, Richard Graves, gave Hearn a copy of the Old English poem now known as the Battle of Malden. The copy had been made, probably in 1724, from the original manuscript in the Cotton Library in London by John Elphinston, the library's former underkeeper and a practiced transcriber of manuscripts. Hearn was able to print the poem in 1726 as an appendix to his edition of the Chronicle of John of Glastonbury. 5 years later, the Cotton manuscript was destroyed in the fire at Westminster, making Hearn's the earliest surviving witness to the poem. In 1727, Hearn's friend John Murray lent him a rather different sort of book, a thin folio paper manuscript done or sewed up in a vellum cover on which it is entitled The Book of Sir Thomas More. This I have read over. It is wrote in the nature of a play or interlude soon after his death, I believe. It was quite an achievement to read it over, and not surprising that he found it hard to make some things out, for this was the manuscript place of Sir Thomas More, written in 6 different hands, of which hand D is thought to be Shakespeare's. Gifts and loans were always useful to Hearn, but most of his own collection was composed of books that he had bought from auctions or dealers. He paid close attention to sales in Oxford, London, and further afield. There were 2 main locations for such sales in Oxford. One was the auction house by St Michael at the Northgate in Ship Street. The other was at St Mary's Church in the High Street. A third site for auctions was across the road from the University Church and was associated with St Mary's Hall, near which Anthony Paisley's bookshop existed. Paisley was involved in auctions at Oxford from the late 1690s until his death in August 1724. He was succeeded by his son. Both Paisleys were well known to Hearn. When the father died, he recorded that he used to have auctions frequently in Oxford, in the old Convocation House at the northeast end of St Mary's Church. Other auctions were held at Mrs. Weaver's dancing school in Holywell and in Cat Street. Sales might also take place in situ. When Joseph Hunt, the Master of Balliol, died in 1726, his library was sold in his study in the college. As might be expected, booksellers could hold auctions in their own shops. Stephen Fletcher held one on his premises in 1718, while James Fletcher Sr. had one in the Turl in 1735. Hearn's notebooks are thick with references to auctions in and beyond Oxford, including some not in standard lists of sales. For example, in April 1728, he recorded that Sir Philip Sydenham's books were offered for sale at £3,000 and that there is a printed catalogue. A retail sale of the books of Josiah Pullen, fellow of Magdalen Hall, who had died in 1714, held at Sherborne in Dorset in August 1722, is known only from Hearn's reference to it. Sales of books belonging to John Lawton, the Cambridge University librarian, were held at Sheffield in December 1713 and at York in October 1714. It's interesting, these provincial book sales of quite eminent people. Just after Lawton's death, Hearn recorded an otherwise unknown first sale of books in October 1712. Thomas Baker probably told him about it, saying, "I do not doubt but they have been sold at great prices, his collection being extraordinary." He was wise to the ways of booksellers and auctioneers. Dr. Brathwaite's collection, sold by auction in June 1731, had been culled many years ago. When the books of Miles Stapleton, a former Fellow of All Souls, were sold at the old auction room near Northgate in June 1733, Hearn noticed that there are many good books in it, but I suppose 'twas picked before exposed to sale. He added that persons were set, what is common in auctions, to raise the price. This method in auctions is a downright cheat and makes honest men shy in bidding for anything from them. I'm sure such things don't happen today. Modern auctions are not, as Hearn claimed, often guided by humour, not skill or judgment. More seriously, Hearn recorded that the wealthy Lord Foley, a sort of madman, had a very curious collection of books and pictures, but was so very whimsical, as if he had duplicates, to destroy all excepting one of a sort. Nay, he used to buy up duplicates on purpose with that view, being ambitious of having the only one, a sort of vanity most certainly to be condemned. Hearn kept a close eye on what certain books sold for in auctions. He was shocked when Walter Clavell paid £27 at Charles Bernard's sale in 1711 for the Paris, really London, 1584 edition of Giordano Bruno's Spazio della Besta Trionfante. He called this a foolish and a silly idle book, and was still thinking about the price it reached 15 years later. The amounts fetched by Holinshead's and Speed's chronicles were a source of constant interest to him, as were the prices that his own publications, especially the editions of Leyland, fetched. Books bought at auctions and in bookshops afforded Hearn something else besides the pleasure of owning them. In at least two cases, by buying their books, he perhaps derived a sense of revenge on those who had betrayed and sought to punish him. He was particularly interested in the sales of the libraries of two of his antagonists, John Hudson, who effectively got him sacked from the Bodleian, and Arthur Charlotte, master of University College, his patron and then his enemy. Univ got first choice from Hudson's library, but were not nice in examining it. Hearn may well have attended the sale at St Mary's Church on 21st of March 1720, but no copy of the catalogue is known. He was much more actively involved in the Charlotte sale. Charlotte had died on 8th of November 1722, and his near 4,000 volumes were bought by the Oxford bookseller John Wilmot for 500 guineas. In December 1723, Hearn acquired 13 works from Wilmot, paying £19 10s for them. The unique copy of Josiah Howe's 1644 sermon, a quarto in twos, printed mainly in red italics, that had cost Charlotte 5 shillings, one of the greatest rarities I ever saw, was purchased in January. It had been bound in a volume of sermons, occasioning the bookseller to overlook it as an ordinary common thing and of little or no value. Charlotte, he noted, used often to speak of this sermon, but I could never get a sight of it from him. Hearn had it rebound on its own. He was again at Wilmot's shop in February 1724, spending over £10 on Charlotte's books. 4 days later, he was back at the shop, buying a copy of the 1561 edition of The Vision of Piers Plowman for 1 6d, and another book for £1. The visits continued in March, and Hearn was still buying Charlotte's books from Wilmot more than 2 years later, when he acquired an earlier edition of The Vision for 5 shillings. It's hard not to see some unfinished business being acted out in Hearn's frequent purchases of his former friend Charlotte's books. Hearn's earlier acquaintance with Charlotte's books also gave him what was evidently one of his favourite pleasures, acquiring a book he had long wanted. In 1718, Ralph Bridges, James's brother, showed him a copy of Richard Verstegen's 1592 book of engravings of Catholic martyrdoms. This was the only copy Hearn had ever seen. Later, I'm sparing you the contents of it, which are too horrible to look at this time of day, or any time of day. This was the only copy Hearn had ever seen. Later he noted, I have since this purchased one myself. And having seen a copy of both volumes of the first edition of Holinshead's Chronicles with their woodcuts, he recorded that he only had the first volume, but afterwards noted with glee, I have since got the second vol. One of the greatest triumphs he recorded in the same way, I have since got one myself, was to acquire a copy of Ralph Aggas's 1588 map of Oxford. Where it is now, I don't know. There were 4 booksellers in Oxford with whom Hearn did business, the Clements and Paisley families, Stephen Fletcher and John Wilmot. Henry Clements, a very industrious man, acted as an agent for Hearn's publications. His son, also Henry, did the same in London. Clements' shop was not far from the old schools, the Bodleian Quadrangle. Stephen Fletcher's bookshop was in the High Street. Hearn had a standing order with Positive Fletcher, or Pos Fletcher, for any curious books, particularly such as relate to English history. Fletcher issued catalogues, but refused to give one of these to Hearn for a sale in 1727, which is what I thought he would do. In St Mary Hall Lane, Anthony Paisley ran his bookshop until his death in 1724. He held auctions, issued catalogues, and bought studies of books from deceased academics. Occasionally, he had books such as a set of the Complutensian Polyglot Bible that excited interest. Hearn examined it for his friend Bridges and laconically noted that it was worm-eaten and in many places taken wet, 6 guineas. In 1725, Corpus Christi College decided to sell off some of the books that had been bequeathed by a former fellow, Cuthbert Ellison. Among them was a copy of the 1568 edition of John Key's De Antiquitate Cantabrigiensis Academiae Libri Duo, with manuscript notes in it by the Corpus Fellow Miles Windsor, who died in 1624 and left books to the college. Hearn snapped it up. The fourth bookseller who featured regularly in Hearn's life was Samuel Wilmot, whose premises were in the Turl, or Thorold Street, as he affectedly called it. Wilmot issued catalogues and bought academic libraries. Hearn and Wilmot often clashed, with the bookseller not showing Hearn items that he very much wanted to see. Wilmot wanted 10 guineas for John Bayle's own annotated but imperfect copy of Scriptorum Catalogus 1557, for which Hearn would not give more than 2 guineas at furthest, a good round price. On the other hand, Wilmot liked telling Hearn what he had got for copies of Hearn's own publications, 2 guineas each for his edition of Roper's Life of More and of the Acta Apostolorum. He refused to part with Charlotte's copies of Leland's Itinerary and Collectanea for less than 20 guineas. As well as big and expensive books, such as the bulky illustrated editions, folios of Gravius and Gronovius on Roman and Greek antiquities that Wilmot sold to one of the Dutch Wettstein family of booksellers and publishers for £50, Wilmot had wonderful rare old books like Harding's 1543 Chronicle, De Word's Higden's Polychronicon, fair but worm-eaten much, Fabian's Chronicle, both at 4 guineas each, and Richard Arnold's The Customs of London, in which the Nut-Browned Maid, the famous ballad, was first printed. This cost Hearn £1.50 guineas. Other booksellers in and near the city supplied him with books. Old Nicholas Cox had been Manciple of St Edmund Hall and became pretty eminent, especially in old books, particularly Bibles and plays. Further away at Stratford-upon-Avon, John Fancourt dealt in old books and manuscripts of the kind Hearn loved, Shadle's Chronicle, De Ward's 1595 edition of Bartholomeus Anglicus, a bishop's Bible, a manuscript of Petrarch, but which Hearn's friend Thomas Ward tended to acquire. I would be the first to admit that it is difficult to do justice to the breadth and depth of Hearn's library in a single lecture. His interest in the rare, the scarce, and the curious was not simply idle. Collecting books was for him an essential form of scholarship, and not just because of his exclusion from the Bodleian. With no immediate source of income, publishing became his business. His collections fed the extraordinary scholarly enterprise that I shall attempt to describe next week. Thank you very much.
Huge thank you for such a vivid description of book collecting at the time. I think we have time for a couple of questions. Shall we take questions in the room? And I think if there are any coming in online, if not, if people listening online wish to add questions, please add them.
Tony Edwards.
Okay.
Yep. Tony going to ask a question?
Oh, sorry, please, go ahead.
This isn't a fair question, but it's one that interests me a little. Is it clear, is there any pattern of the dispersal of Hearn's book in this sense? in his sale, sale after his death?
Not as far as I can tell. I don't think there is a fully marked up catalogue of what things sold for. And the fact that it's a mixed sale makes it quite difficult. I thought at one point I'd identified the other gentleman whose library was being sold simply by looking at who subscribed. There are a lot of subscription copies of books in the catalogue, and if you look at enough copies of them, you can sometimes find the same name occurring. And I think I've found one name that occurs several times. But I think what was happening in the end was it was not a single gentleman. It was booksellers offloading stock, which happened a great deal at the time. But no, I'd love to find out more, and I would love to see where the books that were in the sale catalogue, the auction catalogue, where they have ended up. But no, I don't know of any pattern at the moment. I mean, the catalogue is a big one, 216 pages or so, and it takes a little while to work through it if you're looking for a particular item.
Any further questions?
Any online?
Any online that we've got?
Nothing online, but may I have my own?
Yes, please. Go for
Peter.
it.
Did he have manuscripts fragments in Greek or other languages other than Latin or English?
French, but I have not seen all of. I haven't worked properly through the volumes of manuscript fragments. I don't think there's anything in Greek, and I think that most of them came from the manuscript fragments came from bookbinders, as well as from bookbindings. It was bookbinders who bought up parchment and used it in their bookbindings, and he and his friends would ask bookbinders, "Have you got anything old that I can have?" And most of what they had come, I suspect, from medieval manuscripts that had been imported into England or that had been made in England. So I don't think there's much of a sort of really international trade. But I'm not expert in manuscripts, so I can't localize the manuscripts, I'm afraid. I have looked out for Greek, and I've looked out for Hebrew as well, and I've found the occasional word in Hebrew among some of the fragments, but I think the Hebrew may be that of someone who's learnt a few words in Hebrew and just writes it in as a sort of talisman of some kind, rather than using it as an intelligent commentary on what's being written there. But I will keep an eye out for anything Greek.
Okay, we've just time to squeeze in one more, I think. Just wait for the microphone,
James.
I think.
Yes.
There we go.
Yes, it's a quick question. There was nothing about what you were saying from either Hearn or Hearn's commentaries on others about an ideal size of a collection. I'm sort of thinking of Pepys. Nothing about that, it seemed.
No. I've not come across anything. I mean, I think in Hearn's view that more books, the better. And I think that he used. I suspect he used every inch of his rooms in Teddy Hall were covered with shelves of books, and that there was. I mean, I don't think he put them across the windows quite, but I think it was quite serious. His addiction and the use he made of them. I think the extraordinary working through the two catalogues and the bundles that he kept, which I suspect were unbound, but were tied up with ribbon or something or string even. Some of them had 150 items in them that he just classed together and held together. So I think there were some special books that he kept in some of the named bookcases, but I haven't yet worked out, and it's quite difficult to do because Teddy Hall divided Hearn's rooms into two sets of rooms, of course. So it's difficult to reconstitute the rooms properly. How he arranged the books around the shelves and what the rooms looked like originally. I started off thinking that he never let anyone into his rooms, which I sort of touched on last week, but I think actually he did. And I think he quite liked showing books to people and talking about them in the evening, spending an evening with friends talking about books and showing them rarities. And I think that, this goes back to what I was saying a little of last week, that he was much more sociable than perhaps most people who have written about Hearn and wanted him to be the grumpiest man in the grumpiest city in the world. He was much more sociable and enjoyed the company of young men quite a lot. And he particularly enjoyed the company of rich young men from good colleges and good families. And I'm not trying to turn him into John Sparrow, but he sort of, he encouraged young men like James West at Balliol to collect books and to take an interest in books. And it worked well for him because they were richer than he was, considerably, and were able to hand him rather nice gifts from time to time.
Great.
Good.
Thank you once again. And if you can join me once again, so thank you.
Thank you very much.
I look forward to seeing everyone next week for the third lecture.